You have never once said no. Not really. You've said, let me check, and I'll try. And that could work, actually. But the word itself, the two-letter one, the one with no follow-up sentence required, has never made it out of your mouth as an adult. Not to your mother, not to your boss, not to the friend who calls at 11 p.m. with a problem that is, once again, somehow going to become your problem by midnight. You tell yourself this is because you're easygoing, because you're the kind of person who doesn't make things difficult. And for a while, that story holds. It holds right up until the night you're lying awake doing math on your own exhaustion, trying to figure out how you ended up hosting, organizing, covering, agreeing, again, to something your entire body voted against in the first half second before your mouth overruled it. That half second is where this book lives. Not in the yes, in the gap right before it, where something in you already knew and said it anyway. Here's the part nobody tells you. This isn't a personality trait you were born with. It's not evidence of your good character, and it's definitely not proof that you're simply nicer than the people who somehow managed to decline things without a 3-paragraph apology attached. It's a strategy. A very old one, built for a very specific set of circumstances, most of which stopped applying to your life a long time ago. You built it to stay safe. It's kept you liked, kept you needed, kept the peace in rooms that felt too dangerous to disturb. And it has quietly, patiently, been costing you the one thing it was supposed to protect. The version of you that was never actually optional. This is where you find her again. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The word you've never said. Thanksgiving is at your house again this year. Nobody asked you, technically. It just happened, the way it's happened for 9 years running, the way water finds the lowest point in a room without needing a map. Your cousin mentioned maybe hosting in the family group chat back in August. And by the time you'd finished reading the message, you were already mentally rearranging your dining table and wondering if you still had that extra leaf for it in the garage. You didn't offer. You didn't have to. Everyone simply understood, the way people understand weather, that this was already decided. You will spend 6 hours the day before scrubbing a house that 4 different family members will criticize by dinner time. You will make a turkey for people who will complain about the stuffing. You will smile through a comment about your job, your weight, your relationship status, whatever this year's designated topic turns out to be, and you will absorb it the way you absorb everything, quietly, immediately, with a small internal wince that nobody else will ever see. And somewhere around hour 4 of cleanup, alone in your kitchen with everyone else on the couch digesting, something in your chest will tighten in a way that has become so familiar, you've stopped registering it as a feeling and started treating it as furniture. That tightness has a name, and it isn't gratitude. Here's what almost nobody says out loud about people who do this, who host and cover and absorb and accommodate on a loop that never seems to break. It isn't kindness. It looks exactly like kindness from the outside, which is precisely the problem. Real kindness comes from a full tank. It's a person with abundant warmth deciding to share some of it because sharing feels good and costs them very little. What you're doing is not that. What you're doing comes from somewhere much colder, which is fear. Fear that if you stop offering, stop absorbing, stop being the reliable center everyone orbits without a second thought, something will shift that you are not prepared to survive. You've been called easygoing so many times it stopped sounding like an observation and started sounding like an identity. Easy to work with, easy to be around. The friend who never makes things complicated. You collected these descriptions the way other people collect actual compliments. And for years, you mistook them for exactly that. But sit with the phrase for a second. Easy to work with. That's not a compliment about your character. That's a review of your convenience. Nobody has ever described a boulder as easygoing. They call it that because it doesn't move, doesn't resist, doesn't require any negotiation to get exactly what they want from it. There is a version of you, you know this, even if you've stopped visiting her regularly, who would have said something different in August, who would have read that group chat message and typed, "Not this year, actually. Someone else should take a turn." That sentence exists. It's 4 words longer than sounds good. And you have never once said it. Not because you lack the vocabulary, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that your comfort was the thing everyone else's comfort got built on top of. And pulling out from underneath it felt less like self-care and more like structural collapse. I used to think I was unusually generous with my time. I told people that actually, with a kind of quiet pride, I'm just someone who shows up. It took me embarrassingly long to notice that I never once asked myself whether I wanted to before I did it. The wanting wasn't part of the calculation, only the asking was. This is the mechanism worth understanding before anything else in this book makes sense. Somewhere in your history, you ran a version of the math that concluded giving was safer than asking. That your value in a room was directly tied to what you provided, not to the simple, unremarkable fact of your presence in it. And once that math gets run enough times, it stops being a decision. It becomes a reflex, faster than thought, activating in the half-second before your conscious mind even gets a vote. That's the yes that arrives before the reflection. The one that isn't really a choice at all, just a trained response firing off exactly the way it was built to. And underneath it, every single time, is a quieter transaction nobody's negotiating out loud. I will keep being useful, and in exchange, you will keep me around. The exhausting part isn't the hosting, or the covering, or the 6 hours of cleanup. The exhausting part is that none of it ever actually closes the account. You can give everything you have this year and the math resets to 0 by next August. Because the debt was never really about turkey and table leaves. It was about proving, over and over, in whatever form the moment demanded, that you deserved to stay in the room. And a debt like that, one that isn't actually owed, that was never real in the first place, cannot be paid off. It can only be stopped. That stopping doesn't start with a dramatic confrontation, or a family meeting, or a speech about your needs. It starts smaller than that. It starts with noticing the half-second. The gap between the request landing and the yes leaving your mouth. Just noticing it the first few times, without doing anything about it yet. Because you cannot interrupt a pattern you've never actually watched happen. And you have been so busy managing everyone else's experience of you that you have never once, not really, watched your own. Chapter 2. The room you learned to read. There's a particular kind of stillness a kid learns to hold at a dinner table. Not boredom stillness, not the fidgety kind. A tracking stillness, spine straight, eyes doing quiet reconnaissance across a parent's jaw, the set of their shoulders, the exact rhythm of how a fork is being set down. Too hard means something. Too quiet means something else. And the kid at that table, maybe 7, maybe 9, has already run the calculation and adjusted before a single word gets spoken. Doesn't ask for seconds. Doesn't mention the thing that happened at school. Keeps the report card conversation for later or never, depending on how the fork sounded. Nobody trained that kid to do this. Nobody sat them down and explained the family's emotional weather system. They just learned it the way you learn anything that keeps you safe. Through repetition, through consequence, through 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays that individually meant nothing, and collectively rewired how a nervous system understood the word home. This is the part people get wrong when they imagine the origin of people-pleasing. They go looking for the big thing, the single catastrophic afternoon you could point to and say, "There, that's where it started." And for a small number of people, there is a moment like that. But for most, there isn't one scene. There's a climate. A home where certain emotions were expensive to express. Anger especially, but sometimes just ordinary sadness. The kind that made a parent visibly uncomfortable, prompt a change of subject, an eye roll, a "you're fine," delivered less as comfort and more as instruction. And a kid absorbing that instruction over and over doesn't conclude, "My sadness is inconvenient right now." They conclude something much larger and much quieter. My sadness is inconvenient. Full stop. And the safest version of me is the one who doesn't have it where anyone can see. Maybe your household ran on something else. A parent whose mood could shift without warning, where the temperature of a room could change in the time it took someone to walk through a doorway. If that was your Tuesday, you developed a specific and genuinely impressive skill. You became fluent in reading a person before they'd said a single word. The set of a jaw, the particular flatness in a voice on the phone in the next room. You could tell, often before they could tell themselves, which direction the day was heading, and you adjusted your own volume accordingly. Smaller, quieter, more agreeable, because agreeable was the version of you least likely to catch any of the weather directly. That skill got you called sensitive, intuitive. Old soul, maybe, if anyone was being generous about it. And it's true you became remarkably attuned to other people's internal states, but not because you were born with some rare emotional gift. You became attuned because accuracy was the whole game. Read the room wrong, and the room got worse. Read it right, and you got to stay small and safe inside it a little longer. I watched a friend do this once at a birthday dinner, years ago. Nothing dramatic, just her father raising his voice slightly at a waiter. And I watched her shoulders drop half an inch, and her whole face rearrange into something easier, something that took up less space, before the sentence was even finished. She wasn't scared of the waiter. She was running old math on autopilot. Math that had nothing to do with that room at all. Here's the part that matters most, and it's easy to miss because it doesn't sound dramatic enough to be true. That adaptation worked. It did exactly what it was built to do. It kept a kid safer inside an unpredictable environment. And that's not nothing. That's a nervous system doing its actual job, which is keeping you alive inside the conditions you were handed. The problem was never that the skill got built. The problem is that nobody ever told it the emergency was over, so it kept running. Into classrooms, where a raised hand felt like a risk not worth taking. Into first relationships, where disagreement got treated with the same caution you'd apply to a parent's changing mood, even though the person across from you had never once given you a reason to expect an explosion. Into your current job, where a manager's slightly clipped tone in an email sends the same low-grade alarm through your body that used to mean something was actually at stake. Maybe your particular version of this had a slightly different shape. Love that arrived on a schedule tied to performance. Good grades got warmth. A clean room got approval. Being no trouble got you the kind of pride from a parent that felt, in the moment, like the realest thing in the world. If that was your climate, you learned something equally durable. That affection is a thing you earn through sustained output, not something that simply exists because you exist. And a lesson like that doesn't stay contained to childhood. It becomes the operating logic for every relationship that follows. whether the people in those relationships ever asked for that kind of performance from you or not. None of this is a life sentence. That's the part worth sitting with before you move any further into this book. A tool built inside one set of circumstances doesn't have to keep operating inside every circumstance that follows. But you can't retire a tool you've never actually looked at directly. And that kid at the table, the one doing quiet reconnaissance on a fork, deserves better than to keep running the same watch shift forever in rooms that stopped needing a lookout a long time ago. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, the inventory of a disappearing act. You apologize to furniture. Not out loud, necessarily, but the internal wince is there. You walk into a coffee table in your own living room, a piece of furniture that has never once complained about anything, and some reflexive part of you still produces a small, silent sorry before you've even registered the pain in your shin. This is not a joke, or rather it is, but it's the kind of joke that's actually a diagnosis. Somewhere in you, a default setting got installed a long time ago that treats your own existence, your presence, your needs, the simple physical fact of taking up 3-dimensional space in a room, as something that requires ongoing justification. And that setting doesn't switch off just because the audience happens to be inanimate. Let's build the actual inventory, because these patterns thrive specifically on staying invisible. And invisibility is the one thing they can't survive being named out loud. The first entry is the automatic yes. Someone asks for something, anything, a favor, a ride, an extra project at work dressed up as an opportunity. And the agreement is already out of your mouth before your conscious mind has finished processing the request. It isn't a decision. There was no moment of genuine consideration where you weighed your actual capacity or desire against the ask. It's a reflex, the fastest available route past the discomfort of a pause that might, in someone else's mind, read as reluctance. And right behind the yes, always, comes a small, private tightening. Some part of you registering, a beat too late to matter, that the answer wasn't accurate. The second entry is the constant surveillance. You are rarely fully inside your own conversations, because a meaningful chunk of your attention is permanently stationed elsewhere, monitoring the other person's face for the earliest flicker of displeasure. Did that land wrong? Are they annoyed? Was that too much? Too little? Too weird? This runs constantly, underneath whatever you're actually saying, and it means you experience maybe 60% of most interactions, while the other 40% is spent standing just outside them, bracing. The third is the apology reflex, and this is the one that shows up in places that have nothing to do with wrongdoing at all. Sorry to bother you, prefacing a completely reasonable work email. Sorry, this is probably a dumb question. Prefacing a question that turns out to be the smartest one in the room. Sorry, before someone else walks into you. Each instance on its own looks like manners. Stacked together across a decade, they form something closer to a standing legal argument you've been quietly building your entire adult life. A case for why your presence requires a permit that other people simply get to walk around without. The fourth is what happens to an opinion the moment it meets the slightest resistance. You'll hold off voicing a perspective until you've heard what everyone else thinks first, a kind of reconnaissance before commitment. And when you do finally offer something, It arrives pre-apologized, hedged before it's even finished leaving your mouth. I don't know, maybe, but I could be totally wrong about this. Then someone pushes back, even gently, even without any real conviction behind it, and the opinion folds. Not because you heard something that genuinely changed your mind, because disagreement itself, any disagreement, registers somewhere in your body as a low-grade threat. And the fastest way to make a threat recede is to remove whatever's causing the friction, which in this case is your own thought. The fifth entry is the resentment you've gotten remarkably skilled at not naming. You give generously, consistently, often well past the point where giving felt good, and something underneath all that generosity has started to sour. Not rage exactly. Something quieter and more corrosive. A background hum of grievance about roles you keep occupying without ever quite agreeing to occupy them. And when you notice that hum, your instinct is to shame it into silence. You tell yourself you're being ungrateful, that nobody's actually forcing you to do any of this. And then, in a move that would be almost funny if it weren't so exhausting, you respond to the resentment by giving even more, as though a bigger performance of generosity might retroactively cancel out the anger underneath it. It never does. It just goes further underground and waits. I used to think of myself as an unusually patient person, someone who simply didn't get rattled by other people's moods the way some of my friends did. It took years to notice that what actually looked like patience was closer to a full-time surveillance job I'd never applied for and was never getting paid to do. The sixth and final entry is your relationship to conflict itself, which you don't experience as a normal, occasionally uncomfortable part of being close to other people. You experience it as an emergency requiring immediate containment. The moment friction appears anywhere near a relationship that matters to you, the entire machine activates. You absorb blame that was never yours. You make yourself smaller in the presence of someone else's frustration. You go quiet on things that genuinely matter to avoid disturbing a peace that, if you're honest, only exists because you've been the one paying for it. None of these six things, looked at in isolation, seem like much. That's precisely the design. A single automatic yes, one reflexive apology, doesn't register as a pattern. It registers as a personality trait, a minor quirk, just the way you are. It's only when you lay all six side by side, when you actually take the inventory instead of living inside it unexamined, that you see the shape of what's actually been running your life. And you cannot dismantle a structure you've never once looked at directly. Seeing it clearly, without flinching away, and without turning it into a reason for self-punishment, is not a small first step. It is, honestly, the hardest work this whole process is going to ask of you, because it means finally admitting the furniture was never the one that needed the apology. Chapter 4. The bill comes due. It's 2:14 in the morning, and you are doing forensic analysis on a text message you sent 6 hours ago. Not the whole message. One word in it. Sounds good. You're turning it over like it's a piece of evidence in a trial nobody else knows is happening, wondering if the exclamation point read as too enthusiastic, or not enthusiastic enough, or somehow both at once depending on how tired the recipient was when they opened it. Your body is exhausted. Your mind will not stop working the case. This is not insomnia in the ordinary sense. This is a nervous system that has been running a background audit for so long it no longer knows how to power down, even when there's genuinely nothing left to audit. This is where the bill comes due, and it rarely arrives as one dramatic invoice. It arrives quietly, in installments, disguised as things that don't obviously connect back to the 6 patterns from the last chapter. A tiredness that sleep doesn't touch, a tension in your shoulders that seems to have taken up permanent residence, a background hum of unease that follows you into rooms where nothing is actually wrong. Here's what's happening underneath it. Every time you say yes while your actual, honest interior is registering a clear no, your body doesn't just note the discrepancy and move on. It treats the gap between what you feel and what you performed as a small stress event, not a catastrophic one. Nothing your body would flag as an emergency on its own, but a real one nonetheless. And a body that absorbs that particular kind of event once a day, sometimes several times a day, for years, doesn't stay in a resting state. It adapts the way any system adapts to sustained pressure, by resetting its baseline. Anxiety stops being the thing you feel in response to genuine danger and starts being simply the temperature of the room you live in all the time, regardless of what's actually happening around you. You feel tired in a way that 8 hours of sleep does nothing to fix, because the exhaustion was never primarily physical. It's the particular fatigue of someone who has been on stage, in some form, for the better part of 2 decades, and has never once been allowed to fully step off it, even alone. Even at 2:14 in the morning, doing forensic work on an exclamation point that nobody else in the world remembers sending. And it doesn't stay contained to your interior. It reaches out and shapes who ends up in your life, and how. When you operate without real, held boundaries, you don't end up surrounded by people who respect the whole of who you are. You end up surrounded, disproportionately, by people who've grown comfortable in a dynamic where they receive consistently and reciprocate occasionally, if at all. Not necessarily because they're bad people, but because your behavior over years has quietly taught them that your yes is dependable and your no is close to theoretical. They've built their expectations of you on the evidence you kept providing. I had a friend for almost a decade who I would have described, if you'd asked me, as one of my closest people. It took an outside observer, someone new, meeting us both for the first time, to ask almost casually, does she ever actually ask how you're doing? Or does she just tell you things? I didn't have an answer ready. I'd never once considered the question, because the relationship had always run exactly the way it was running, and I'd mistaken its familiarity for its health. Meanwhile, the people who might have offered something genuinely different, the ones secure enough in themselves to actually hear a boundary without treating it as an attack, who could handle the word no arriving from you without needing to punish you for it. Those people often drift, quietly, without any obvious rupture. Not out of cruelty, because connecting with someone who has no visible edges, who bends readily to whatever's needed of them, is genuinely difficult to do at any real depth. Authentic connection requires 2 actual people showing up as themselves. You cannot form something real with a surface that only ever reflects back whatever's brought to it. And then there's the cost that runs deepest, the one that operates below almost everything else. What all of this does to your relationship with yourself. Every time you override your own need in service of someone else's momentary comfort, you're not just making a single choice in a single moment. You're sending a message, and your nervous system is listening, filing it away alongside every nearly identical message that came before it. The message is simple, and it is corrosive. Yours matters less, and your mind, which is an extraordinarily efficient pattern recognition machine, receives that message and quietly builds a case out of it. A case for the belief that you are, in some basic and ongoing way, less deserving of consideration than the people around you. That belief is false. It has never once been true. But it has been reinforced with such consistency across so many small daily instances that by now it doesn't feel like a belief at all. It feels like simple fact, the kind you wouldn't think to argue with any more than you'd argue with gravity. And the cruelest part of the mechanism is how self-sustaining it becomes. You believe you matter less, so you act as though you matter less, which produces more behavioral evidence for the belief, which deepens your conviction that it must be accurate, which produces more of the same behavior. A loop with no outside input required, closing quietly around itself, year after year, invoice after invoice. This isn't happening because kindness is dangerous or generosity is a mistake. Kindness remains one of the most valuable things a person can offer another. It's happening because what you've actually been practicing isn't kindness. It's the performance of kindness, deployed as a strategy for managing your own fear, and no nervous system was built to sustain that particular performance indefinitely without eventually sending you the bill. You've been getting invoices for years, disguised as bad sleep, tight shoulders, and a background hum you assumed was just how you're wired. It was never how you're wired. It was simply how long the account had been left unpaid. Chapter 5. The Reliable One. Someone else on your team said no to the extra project last week. You watched it happen in real time, in a meeting, over video call. A flat, unbothered, "I don't think I can take that on right now without dropping something else." Delivered with no apology attached, no elaborate justification, nothing but the sentence itself sitting there in the silence afterward. And the manager just nodded, moved on, assigned it to someone else instead. That someone else was you, and you said yes before the sentence asking had even finished, the way you always do, the way that by now feels less like a choice and more like something your mouth does independently of the rest of you. You will spend the next 6 weeks doing 2 people's work for one person's recognition, and somewhere around week 4 you will notice with a kind of dull, familiar surprise that nobody has once said thank you in a way that felt proportional to what it actually cost you. This is not a mystery. This is the specific and quietly brutal economy that people-pleasing runs inside a workplace, and it operates by rules that are different enough from the ones at home or in friendship that it deserves its own honest look. At work, the currency isn't love exactly, though it can feel disturbingly close to it. The currency is being needed. Being the person a manager can hand anything to without worrying about pushback, without having to manage a negotiation, without risk of the request landing somewhere complicated. And here's the trap. Dressed up so convincingly, it takes most people years to see it clearly. Being needed in that specific way gets labeled constantly as a compliment. "You're such a team player, so dependable. I don't know what we'd do without you." Each phrase lands like praise, and you absorb it the way you've always absorbed praise, filing it away as evidence that you're valued, that you belong, that the exhausting math you've been running is finally paying dividends. But listen to what those phrases are actually describing. They are not describing your judgment, your ideas, your particular expertise, the specific and irreplaceable thing only you bring to a room. They are describing your availability, your willingness to absorb more than your share without generating friction on the way in. And an organization, any organization, staffed by generally decent people who are nonetheless operating inside a system that rewards efficiency, will always keep handing weight to the person who never sets it down. Not out of malice, because that's simply what the incentive structure produces. The path of least resistance in any workplace runs directly through whoever has demonstrated reliably that they won't resist. I spent 3 years at a job being quietly proud of the fact that I was the person people came to when something needed to get done fast, without complications. It took a colleague, someone genuinely kinder than the system around her, pulling me aside to say, gently, that she'd noticed I hadn't taken a lunch break in longer than she could remember. And did I know that? I didn't. I'd stopped tracking it entirely, the way you stop noticing a hum in a room you've lived in long enough. The particular cruelty of this dynamic is how well it disguises itself as a compliment being paid to your character, when it's actually a compliment being paid to your convenience. And the person who said no in that meeting, the one who declined the extra project without an apology attached, wasn't punished for it the way some part of you probably assumed she would be. She went home on time. She kept her actual priorities intact. And critically, nobody thought less of her for it, because a boundary stated plainly, without excessive justification, doesn't read to most reasonable people as difficult. It reads as clear. It's only inside your own head, running old math built for an entirely different kind of danger, that a boundary sounds like an act of aggression instead of a simple, ordinary piece of information about your capacity. There's a specific version of this that shows up for people who've been rewarded, historically, for being the reliable one. The good student, the responsible sibling, the employee who never generates a problem. If that was your particular route into this pattern, work becomes an unusually seductive place to keep performing it, because unlike family or friendship, work offers you something that looks almost exactly like proof. Raises. Promotions, sometimes. A title with more responsibility attached to it, which feels, in the moment, like validation of the entire strategy. See, this is working. This is exactly what gets you ahead. And it can work, for a while, in the narrow sense that it does often get rewarded. What it costs you doesn't show up on a performance review. It shows up in your body, in a slow accumulation of resentment you're not allowed to name at work any more than you're allowed to name it anywhere else, and in a growing gap between the version of you that gets praised in meetings and the version of you that exists at home, depleted, wondering when exactly you agreed to be available at every hour a message might arrive. Here's the reframe worth sitting with. Saying no to additional weight isn't a risk to your professional value. It's frequently the thing that clarifies it. A person who takes on everything without distinction sends an unintentional signal that their time has no particular hierarchy of importance, that anything can be added to the pile because nothing on the pile was ever protected in the first place. A person who says, clearly and without 3 paragraphs of justification, I can take that on, but something else will need to move, is not weaker in that room. They're the only one in the room whose time reads as though it actually has a value attached to it. You don't have to become someone who declines everything to correct this. That's not the goal. And chasing it would just be the same performance running in reverse. The goal is smaller and more specific. Noticing the reflex, the half-second where the yes arrives before any actual accounting of your bandwidth has happened, and interrupting it just long enough to ask the question you've been skipping for years. Not, will this disappoint them if I decline? The other one, do I actually have this to give right now, or am I about to hand over something I don't have? Because handing it over has always felt safer than finding out what happens if I don't. Chapter 6. The audience that never shows up. You gave a toast at your friend's wedding last year that people are still talking about. Genuinely, strangers came up to you afterward, people you'd never met, telling you it was the best one they'd ever heard, that you should do this professionally, that you had a gift. You smiled, said thank you, felt the warmth of it land the way it's supposed to. And then, 3 hours later, driving home alone, something in you went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the wine or the late hour. The compliments were still sitting there, technically true, technically yours, and somehow none of it had actually reached anywhere. It was like applause heard through a thick pane of glass, audible, unmistakably real, and still somehow not touching you. This is the strangest and most disorienting discovery most people-pleasers eventually run into. usually much later than they'd expect. The approval works. It arrives. It's genuine. People mean it when they say it. And it still doesn't fill the thing it was supposed to fill. You can collect an entire lifetime of standing ovations and walk away from every single one of them feeling exactly as hollow as you did before the applause started. And for a long time, this feels like evidence that something is wrong with you specifically, that you're simply broken in some way that makes you incapable of receiving good things. That's not what's happening. What's happening is closer to a design flaw in the strategy itself, one that was baked in from the very beginning. Here's the mechanism, and it's worth sitting with slowly because it explains almost everything else in this book. Underneath every act of people-pleasing, there is a need, and the need was never actually about making the toast land, or making the room comfortable, or making sure nobody at Thanksgiving had anything to complain about. Making people happy is the method. It was never the actual destination. The destination, the real, underlying, entirely human thing you've been chasing this whole time, is to be genuinely seen and found acceptable in the full, unedited version of who you are. Not the curated one you hand people because the curated one felt safer to offer. And that's precisely where the trap closes. When you people please, you're not actually letting anyone see you. You're letting them see a version, polished, calibrated, stripped of whatever felt too risky to expose in that particular room, with that particular audience. And when that version gets loved, gets applauded, gets 3 strangers at a wedding telling you you should do this for a living, some part of you underneath all of it knows, with a certainty that doesn't even bother routing itself through conscious thought, that it doesn't fully count. Not because the compliment was insincere, because they loved the toast, they loved the performance. They didn't get access to the person standing behind it, the one who spent 4 days rewriting that speech 7 times out of fear it wouldn't land, who felt her hands shaking the entire walk to the microphone and told absolutely no one. I used to chase this feeling specifically through work presentations. Oddly enough, not personal moments, professional ones, where the applause felt safer to trust because it came wrapped in something that looked like expertise instead of vulnerability. I'd walk off stage after a good one buzzing for maybe 20 minutes, and then the buzz would drain out of me like water through a cracked cup, and I'd already be thinking about the next one, the next room I needed to win over, as though the last room hadn't actually happened at all. That's the part that makes this so exhausting and so difficult to interrupt on your own. The fix people instinctively reach for is more of the same thing that isn't working. The applause felt good for 11 minutes. So you go looking for the next round, assuming the 11 minutes will stretch longer if you just get a slightly bigger room, a slightly more impressive audience, a slightly more perfect version of the performance. It never stretches. It requires more and more input over time to produce roughly the same brief, thin payoff, which is the exact signature of a substitute standing in for something it was never actually capable of replacing. What you're actually looking for doesn't live in someone else's applause, and it definitely doesn't live in the absence of their disapproval, which is the other direction people-pleasers often chase this same need, through the relief of not being criticized, rather than the presence of being celebrated. Both routes dead end in the same place, because both routes depend entirely on variables outside your control. Someone else's mood, someone else's standards on a given Tuesday, someone else's capacity on any particular day to notice you at all. It lives somewhere quieter than any stage. It lives in the specific, unglamorous moment when you say something true out loud, an actual opinion, an actual preference, an actual no, and you're still standing there afterward, and the room hasn't collapsed, and the person across from you hasn't left, It lives in choosing something for yourself without the guilt spiral you were braced for, and discovering the consequences were survivable, ordinary even. It lives in sitting in your own company with absolutely no audience present, no performance required, and feeling something that is simply, quietly enough. Those moments don't come with strangers approaching you afterward to tell you how impressive you were. They're smaller than that, and stranger, and at first they don't even register as significant. Because you've spent so long calibrating significance according to how loud the external reaction was. But they're the only moments actually capable of building the thing you've been trying to buy through every toast, every project, every flawless performance handed to a room that will forget about it by morning. Real self-worth isn't a verdict delivered by an audience. It's a deposit made privately that nobody else ever needs to witness in order for it to count. And unlike applause, it doesn't drain out through a cracked cup 3 hours later on the drive home. It stays. Chapter 7. Building a spine from the inside. There's a version of this process people imagine before they actually start it, and it usually involves a switch. One day, after enough reading, enough reflection, enough sitting quietly with the right insight, something inside flips permanently to on, and from that point forward, you simply operate as someone who values themselves. The way flipping a light switch changes a room instantly and stays that way until someone flips it back. People wait for that moment. Some of them wait years. It doesn't come, not in the form they're expecting, and the waiting itself becomes its own quiet trap. Because waiting for a switch keeps you passive in the face of something that was only ever going to respond to being built. Self-worth isn't a realization you arrive at. It's not a sentence you finally believe hard enough that it becomes permanently true. It's closer to a savings account than a lightning strike, built slowly through the compounding effect of small, mostly unglamorous choices made consistently over time. Choices that individually look almost too small to matter, and that, stacked across months, constitute an entirely different relationship with yourself than the one you started with. The first real shift, and it's a deceptively demanding one, is learning to stop outsourcing the evaluation of your own value to other people's faces. Right now, whether you're fully tracking it or not, you're running a continuous background process where your sense of yourself moves in direct proportion to how the room is receiving you. Someone's warm, the needle moves up. Someone's distracted, slightly curt, having a bad day that has nothing to do with you, and the needle drops anyway, because your internal instrument was never actually calibrated to distinguish between this is about me and this person is simply tired. Which means your sense of your own worth on any given day is substantially in the hands of people who have no idea they're holding it. The practice that begins to interrupt this sounds almost embarrassingly simple written down, and is genuinely one of the harder things a person can attempt in practice. Pausing after something you've said or done, and asking yourself before checking anyone's face what you actually think about it, not what the room seemed to think, not what you suspect they'll say later, what you think. There's a perspective in you that belongs entirely to you, one that's been buried under years of faster, more available data, other people's reactions, and reclaiming access to it is closer to physical therapy than epiphany. It aches at first. It gets stronger with repetition, not with insight. I remember the first time I tried this deliberately. After a work call where I'd pushed back gently on an idea and immediately spent the next 10 minutes scanning for signs the pushback had landed badly. I made myself stop mid-scan and ask instead what I actually thought of the point I'd made. It took a genuinely uncomfortable amount of effort to even locate an answer under all that scanning. But it was there. Alongside that comes something you might think of as an internal standard, a set of values that belong specifically to you, that you use to evaluate your own behavior independent of whether the room happens to agree with the verdict. This isn't about becoming indifferent to legitimate feedback or building some kind of armored arrogance where criticism bounces off without ever landing. It's about having a home base that doesn't disappear the instant someone expresses displeasure. With that home base in place, criticism becomes something you can actually examine, information to consider, weigh, occasionally accept. Rather than a verdict, your entire sense of self collapses under the moment it arrives. The second component runs parallel to the first. Learning to tolerate discomfort without immediately treating it as proof that something has gone wrong. People pleasers tend to run on an extremely low threshold for interpersonal friction, and that low threshold is a large part of what keeps the whole pattern running. The instant a situation starts to feel uncomfortable, the accommodating behaviors fire automatically to smooth it back over before the discomfort has a chance to simply exist for a moment. But discomfort isn't inherently a warning sign. Often it's the exact sensation that accompanies something genuinely new, a boundary being held for the first time, a truth staying in the room instead of getting quietly withdrawn the moment it meets resistance. Learning to sit inside that discomfort long enough to tell the difference between actual danger and simple unfamiliarity is one of the more useful skills this entire process will ask you to build. The third piece is consistency in how you treat your own basic needs, not the shallow marketed version of that phrase, candles and long baths, though there's nothing wrong with either. The deeper version, whether your rest, your time, your emotional bandwidth get treated as things that genuinely matter, or as leftovers to be addressed only once everyone else's needs have already been handled in full. Every time you treat your own need as a real priority instead of an afterthought, you're sending your nervous system a different message than the one it's been receiving for years, that you count, that your experience registers as data worth acting on. That message, delivered consistently, is what slowly rearranges the internal architecture. And the fourth, probably the most counterintuitive, allowing yourself to be seen struggling without immediately managing how that struggle gets perceived. People pleasers are frequently perfectionists in a very specific, exhausting way, working hard to appear capable and composed, because appearing otherwise feels like it invites exactly the kind of judgment the whole strategy was built to avoid. But self-worth built entirely on the sustained performance of adequacy is worth built on sand. It's built instead in the moments you're honest about not being fine and discover, somewhat to your own surprise, that you're still okay afterward, that the world didn't require the performance in order to keep you in it. This is slow work, and it doesn't announce itself with the satisfying finality of a switch flipping. It asks you to tolerate feeling less certain for a while, in exchange for something that's eventually, permanently more real than certainty ever was. Chapter 8. The sentence that needs no footnote. You have, somewhere in your phone right now, an unsent text message. Maybe more than one. A friend asked if you could help her move this weekend, and instead of answering in the 4 seconds it would have taken to type, "I can't, I have plans," you've spent 20 minutes drafting and redrafting a paragraph, one that explains you'd love to, that you feel terrible, that you have this thing you can't get out of, that you'll absolutely make it up to her, that you hope she understands. You've read it back 4 times. You're not sure if it sounds sincere enough, or if the tone is right, or if this thing needs more detail to be believable. The message sits there, unsent, because some part of you has decided that a plain no isn't going to be enough on its own to survive contact with another person's disappointment. Here's what's actually happening in that 20 minutes, and it's worth naming precisely. You're not drafting an explanation. You're building a legal case. Somewhere along the way, you absorbed the belief that a refusal only becomes legitimate once it's been sufficiently justified. That you need a reason good enough for the other person to accept, evaluate, and formally approve before your no is allowed to stand on its own. And so you construct these elaborate footnotes, sometimes entirely true, sometimes quietly exaggerated, sometimes invented outright, not primarily to communicate your actual situation, but to make the no palatable enough that nobody presses further and nobody's opinion of you shifts as a result. And the problem with an explanation, even an honest one, is what it structurally invites. The moment you offer a reason, you've opened a door you didn't need to open, the door to negotiation. Now the other person has something to work with. They can counter your reason, offer to solve the exact problem you described, remove your stated grounds entirely, and land you right back at yes. Except now you've also spent your energy losing an argument you never needed to have in the first place. A no does not require a reason in order to be real. This might be the single most useful sentence in this entire book, and it will feel, the first several times you try to act on it, deeply and specifically wrong. Like rudeness dressed up as self-respect, like a violation of some unspoken agreement you've honored your whole life without ever consciously signing onto it. So test the belief against your own behavior in the other direction. When someone says no to you, declines an invitation, turns down a request, do you routinely demand they justify it to your satisfaction before you'll accept the answer? Almost certainly not, because in that direction, at least, you already understand something you've never extended to yourself. That people are allowed limits, that those limits don't need your approval to be legitimate, and that pressing someone for an explanation they didn't offer would read, correctly, as a small act of aggression dressed up as reasonable curiosity. You're allowed the exact same standard. Let's talk about the guilt, because pretending it won't show up, or that it shouldn't, isn't useful and isn't honest. When you say no to someone, especially someone you've historically said yes to without exception, you will feel guilty. That guilt is not a moral signal telling you the no was wrong. It's a conditioned alarm, wired into you a long time ago by a nervous system that learned, somewhere back in that dinner table childhood, that a no reliably produced consequences worth fearing. Withdrawal, disapproval, the storm arriving after all. That alarm fires automatically now, regardless of whether the actual current situation carries any real risk at all. The same way a smoke detector goes off over burnt toast. The guilt after a no is evidence the no was new. It is not evidence the no was wrong. Those are two entirely different things, and confusing them is exactly what's kept you drafting paragraphs at midnight for years. I had a mentor once tell me, offhandedly, that she'd stopped explaining her no's around age 40, and it had changed more about her life than almost anything else she'd deliberately worked on. I remember thinking, at the time, that this sounded almost too simple to be the actual lesson. It took me another several years of drafting unnecessary paragraphs myself to understand she wasn't oversimplifying anything. She'd just gotten there first. There's a practical dimension worth having ready before you actually need it. When you're first practicing a clean no after a long history of elaborate ones, it helps to have 2 or 3 phrases that feel genuinely like your own voice, ones you can produce without locking up entirely under pressure. That doesn't work for me. I'm not able to do that. I'm going to pass on this one. Not a paragraph. Not a performance of regret. A direct, warm, complete sentence that communicates the actual answer without cracking the door open for negotiation. Warmth and clarity are not opposing forces. A no delivered kindly is still, unmistakably, a no, and it will register to most reasonable people as exactly that. Clear, not cold. Some people will push back anyway. They'll ask why, or express disappointment with a weight that's clearly designed to make capitulating feel easier than holding your ground. When that happens, you're not required to escalate your justification or produce a better, more convincing reason. You're allowed to simply repeat the answer, unchanged. I understand you're disappointed. I'm still not able to do that. That's a complete sentence. It doesn't need your visible suffering attached to it in order to be believed. And notice, carefully, what it tells you about a relationship. If someone responds to a calm, reasonable no with real anger, or with a sustained coldness that lingers well past the moment itself, it tells you the relationship, at least as it's currently built, wasn't actually running on mutual respect. It was running on the quiet assumption that your yes was permanently available, and your no, if it ever showed up at all, would be treated as a violation of terms nobody ever asked you to agree to out loud. That's painful information to receive. It's also, in the long run, clarifying in a way almost nothing else in this process manages to be. Because a relationship that can't survive your honest limits was never quite as solid as it looked from inside the performance. Chapter 9. The fence, not the sign. Somewhere in your life there's a version of this scene, and it usually goes something like this. You say, calmly and clearly, "Please don't talk to me like that." The person nods, or apologizes, or says something that sounds like agreement. And then 2 weeks later, in some slightly different context, they do it again. So you say it again, same words, maybe a little firmer this time, maybe with a bit more visible frustration in your voice to convey that you're serious. They apologize again. Nothing changes. This cycle can run for years, and at the end of it, you're left with the exhausting conclusion that boundaries simply don't work on this particular person, when the actual problem was never the person. It was the shape of the thing you were calling a boundary in the first place. Most people, and this includes most people-pleasers attempting boundaries for the first time, think of a boundary as a sign. Something you post, verbally, at the entrance of a relationship or in the middle of a conflict. A clearly worded announcement of what is and isn't acceptable, after which the other person is expected to observe it. The way a driver observes a speed limit sign because the sign itself carries some inherent authority. And when the sign gets ignored, the instinct is to repost it. Louder, more detailed, with more emotion attached, as though the deficiency was in the wording rather than in the entire premise. Here's the correction that changes everything downstream of it. A boundary doesn't live in a sign. It lives in a fence. A sign is a request for someone else's cooperation. A fence is a structure you build and maintain yourself, one that holds regardless of whether the other person agrees it should be there. You don't need anyone's permission to erect a fence around what you will and won't participate in. You don't need it acknowledged as fair or reasonable or justified by their standards. What you need is your own willingness to act in alignment with it when it gets tested. And it will get tested almost immediately, usually by exactly the people who benefited most from you never having one before. This distinction matters enormously, because the version of boundary setting most people-pleasers default to still hands all the actual power to the other person. State the limit. Wait to see if it's honored. If it isn't, restate it, maybe with more emphasis, maybe with visible hurt in your voice this time, and wait again. And when it still isn't honored, the conclusion reached is helplessness. The boundary failed, when in fact the boundary was never fully built in the first place. It was announced. It was never backed by an actual consequence that lived inside your own behavior rather than inside someone else's willingness to comply. A real boundary comes attached to a consequence, and the crucial detail is that the consequence is something entirely within your control. Not a threat aimed at the other person, not a punishment you're warning them about, a description of a change in your own behavior that you fully intend to implement the moment the line gets crossed. If you continue speaking to me this way, I'm going to leave the room. If this doesn't change, I won't be able to keep showing up for this particular gathering. If that happens again, I'm not going to be available for it. These aren't ultimatums delivered for dramatic effect. They're honest, calm statements about what you personally will and won't continue participating in, and their entire strength rests on your actual willingness to follow through, not on how convincingly you say them. This is exactly where the pattern makes boundaries feel nearly impossible, because following through almost always involves some degree of the very friction the whole strategy was engineered to avoid. Leaving the room mid-conversation, skipping the gathering, actually becoming unavailable when the moment arrives, rather than caving at the last second, because caving, in that instant, feels so much easier than tolerating someone's visible disappointment. Every time the fear of that disappointment wins, the other person receives a piece of real information, whether either of you says it out loud or not. The fence isn't actually load-bearing, it's decorative. I held a boundary exactly once, early in this process, with someone who'd spent years assuming my silence on a particular subject meant permission. I said what I needed, and when it happened again anyway, I left. No scene, no raised voice, just left. The way I'd said I would. I remember shaking slightly in the car afterward, half convinced I'd just ended something important over what felt, in that moment, like an overreaction. It wasn't an overreaction. It was the first time in that relationship the fence had actually been tested against real weight, and it held, and something in how that person treated me afterward genuinely, permanently shifted. Where do real boundaries actually come from, if not from a list of preferences you've decided to start enforcing on a whim? They come from what you already know you can't keep experiencing without being diminished by it in some specific, nameable way. Your peace of mind, your dignity, your time, your physical safety. A boundary rooted in something you genuinely value holding becomes measurably easier to sustain than one built on a vague sense that you're supposed to have more boundaries. Because the thing you're protecting feels real, and so does the cost of failing to protect it. It also needs to be said plainly. The people who've benefited from your having no fence at all will not be uniformly delighted when one goes up. Some will test it, deliberately or not, to see whether it holds under pressure. Some will tell you that you've changed, that you're being difficult, that you're being selfish. And here is the reframe worth carrying into every one of those moments. Those reactions are not evidence that the fence is wrong. They are evidence that the fence is real, and that the people around you had calibrated their behavior to a landscape that no longer exists. Recalibration is uncomfortable for everyone involved. Your job isn't to apologize for requiring it. Your job is to hold steady while it happens. Because a fence you take down the moment someone leans on it hard enough was never a fence in the first place. It was just a very well-worded sign. Chapter 10. When they liked you better broken. The first time you say no to your sister and actually mean it. Actually let it stand. No follow-up call apologizing. No elaborate explanation offered after the fact to soften it. She doesn't get angry exactly. She gets quiet in a way that's somehow worse. And 2 days later, in a completely unrelated conversation, she says almost offhandedly, "You've changed." not as an observation, as an accusation delivered with just enough lightness that if you pushed back on the tone, you'd be the one who sounded oversensitive. You spend the rest of that day turning the sentence over, wondering what exactly you did wrong, when the honest answer is nothing. You did something right, for possibly the first time in that particular relationship, and it registered to her as a loss. This is the part almost nobody prepares you for when they talk about the rewards of setting boundaries and finally valuing yourself. The reward is real, eventually, but it arrives after a phase that doesn't feel like a reward at all. A phase where the people who benefited most from your old pattern react to its absence with something that can look a lot like anger, a lot like hurt, a lot like a relationship quietly cooling in ways you can feel but can't always name. And if you go into this work expecting universal applause for finally standing up for yourself, that first cold reaction will hit you sideways, hard enough that some part of you will genuinely wonder if you made a mistake. You didn't. Here's what's actually happening underneath a reaction like your sister's, and understanding the mechanism doesn't make it painless, but it does make it legible. A relationship, over enough years, settles into an equilibrium, an unspoken, mutually reinforced set of expectations about who does what, who absorbs what, who bends and who doesn't have to. When you've spent a decade as the one who bends, that role isn't just your individual habit. It's load-bearing for the entire structure of the relationship. The way a support beam is load-bearing for a house, even though nobody in the house thinks about it until it's removed. Change your role, even slightly, even reasonably, and the whole structure feels the shift, whether or not anyone involved can articulate what just happened. Your sister isn't reacting to one no. She's reacting to the sudden absence of an arrangement she'd built real expectations on top of, consciously or not. Expectations about what she could bring to you, what she could count on, what version of the relationship she was operating inside without ever having to ask. That arrangement getting disrupted, even by something as small as one declined favor, produces a reaction disproportionate to the actual event, because the event isn't actually small to the person on the other end of it. It's the first crack in a structure they'd assumed was permanent. The backlash is not confirmation you did something wrong. It's confirmation the change is real. This is worth holding on to with both hands, because without it, the backlash will feel exactly like evidence that you overcorrected, that the old way, however much it cost you, was at least stable, predictable, safe in the specific sense that nobody got hurt by it, including, apparently, you. It's worth naming clearly. The old way did hurt you. It just hurt you quietly enough, over a long enough timeline, that nobody watching from outside ever had to witness it directly. There are specific things people say during this phase, and it helps enormously to hear them named in advance, because forewarned, they land as recognizable patterns rather than personal verdicts. Someone will tell you that you've changed, delivered in a tone that makes unmistakably clear they don't intend it as a compliment. You're allowed to agree with them internally, even if you say nothing out loud. Yes, I have. That's accurate, and it's not an indictment. Someone will call you selfish, usually in a moment when what they actually mean is that you've stopped ranking their preferences above your own in the specific way they'd grown used to. Hold the distinction carefully here, because it matters. Real selfishness is a genuine thing, and it looks nothing like taking your own needs seriously for the first time in years. Someone might tell you you've become cold, or difficult, or hard to be around. Language that tends to surface specifically when what they actually miss is the version of you that asked for nothing and pushed back on nothing, dressed up as a complaint about your character instead. I lost a friendship over this once, cleanly and without drama, over the course of about 4 months. No dramatic falling out, just a steady cooling that followed almost exactly the timeline of me starting to say no to things I'd never declined before. It took me a full year to stop treating that loss as evidence I'd done something wrong, and to start seeing it instead for what it actually was. Proof that the friendship had been built, at least in significant part, on the specific reliable weight of my accommodation, and that once the accommodation stopped, there simply wasn't quite enough underneath it to hold the shape on its own. There's a subtler version of this backlash too, one that's genuinely harder to navigate because it doesn't look like anger at all. It looks like sadness, like someone you love experiencing real, honest confusion or grief as a dynamic they were attached to. Not maliciously, just genuinely attached to, starts to shift under them. This kind is harder because it activates your empathy instead of your defensiveness. It makes you want to fix it, smooth it back over, absorb their discomfort the way you've always absorbed discomfort. And the work here is holding two things at once without letting one collapse the other. Real compassion for what someone else is losing, alongside a genuine refusal to undo the change just because their adjustment to it is painful to witness. Through all of it, the thing worth returning to isn't a rehearsed justification you brandish at anyone who pushes back. It's quieter than that. A private, internal memory of exactly what the old pattern was costing you, the version of yourself it was slowly erasing one accommodation at a time. When the backlash is loud and the guilt is loud right alongside it, that memory is the anchor. Not proof you're right in an argument, just a reminder of why this particular discomfort is worth outlasting the noise. Chapter 11, Mourning the Good One. You catch your reflection in a hallway mirror on an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing significant happening, just walking past on your way to somewhere else. And for a strange half-second, you feel something you weren't expecting to feel. Not pride, not relief exactly. Though you've been telling yourself for months that relief is what all of this is supposed to produce. Something closer to missing someone. Missing her. The version of you who used to live in that reflection, who would have said yes to whatever was being asked before the question even finished. Who kept every room comfortable at the cost of her own, who was, by every external measure available, so much easier to be around. Nobody tells you this part. Every account of this kind of change gets framed as a straightforward win. You set the boundary, you said the no, you finally started valuing yourself, and the story ends there, tidy, resolved, entirely positive. What doesn't get said often enough is that even a change you wanted, even a change that was unambiguously necessary, still has a body count. And the body isn't a person. It's a version of you, one you spent years building, one that got you real things, love in whatever form it arrived, approval, a place in every room you walked into. Losing her, even on purpose, even for good reason, is still a loss. It is allowed to feel like one. This is worth saying plainly, because the grief itself can feel like evidence of backsliding, like proof that some part of you secretly wants the old arrangement back and is therefore not fully committed to the new one. That's not what's happening. Grief and relief are not opposites competing for the same space. They can occupy the exact same week, sometimes the exact same afternoon, without contradicting each other at all. You can feel genuinely lighter for having said the no, and also feel a specific, real ache for the identity that used to say yes automatically. Because that identity, whatever it cost you, was also familiar. It had a shape you knew. It got you things, even if the things it got you weren't the things you actually needed. Think about what the old role actually provided, honestly, without minimizing it just because you now understand its cost. It got you praise. It got you included. It got you a version of belonging that, however conditional, however contingent on continued performance, still felt like belonging while you were inside it. Grieving the loss of that role isn't a sign you've regressed. It's a sign you're being honest about the fact that the role, for all its damage, was doing real work in your life. Work that the new, more honest version of you now has to do differently. And that transition doesn't happen instantly just because you understand it intellectually. I remember, months into this process myself, sitting at a family dinner where I'd finally stopped performing the exhausting cheerfulness I'd always brought to those gatherings, and feeling, underneath the actual relief of not performing, a genuine sadness. For the years spent performing it, yes, but also, strangely, for the loss of a role that had at least been clear. The old version of me knew exactly what she was supposed to do in that room. The new version was still figuring it out, in real time, in front of people who'd known the old script for decades. There's a specific kind of disorientation that shows up here, one worth naming so it doesn't blindside you. For years, your identity was organized substantially around being useful, being agreeable, being the reliable one. And that identity, however costly, gave you a kind of coherence. You knew who you were in any given room, because who you were had been decided in advance by what the room needed from you. As that pattern loosens, a strange gap opens up where the old coherence used to be, and it can feel less like freedom and more like a kind of vertigo. Who are you actually, in a room where you're no longer automatically becoming whatever's required of you? That question doesn't answer itself instantly. It takes time and some real discomfort to fill in. Let yourself hold a small, private ceremony for her if that helps. Not literally, necessarily, but in whatever internal form makes sense to you. She kept you safe for a long time, inside circumstances that genuinely called for safety over authenticity. She wasn't a mistake. She was a solution to a problem that existed once and doesn't anymore. And she deserves to be released with something closer to gratitude than shame. Even as you build someone more honest to take her place, the grief doesn't last forever, and it doesn't need to be resolved before you keep moving forward. It can simply travel alongside the rest of this work, quietly in the background, surfacing occasionally in hallway mirrors and ordinary Tuesdays, asking nothing more than to be noticed rather than dismissed. What replaces her won't arrive as a finished, fully formed identity either, not right away. It arrives the same way she did originally, slowly, through repetition, built out of thousands of small choices that eventually add up to someone you recognize as fully, finally, your own. Chapter 12. The people who survive the upgrade. Two friends, same week, same news. You tell them both separately that you've started saying no to things, that you're trying to hold actual limits for the first time in your adult life. The first one goes quiet on the phone for a second, and then says carefully, "Okay, tell me what that's actually been like for you," and stays on the line for another 40 minutes while you talk it through, awkwardly, still figuring out the language for something you've never had to explain before. The second one laughs, a little too quickly, and says, "Since when?" in a tone that isn't quite hostile but isn't warm either, and changes the subject within about 90 seconds. Neither of them said anything overtly unkind. But you know, almost instantly, which of those two friendships just told you something true about itself? This is the sorting mechanism that starts running the moment you stop performing the old version of yourself, whether you intend to activate it or not. It isn't dramatic, and it doesn't usually announce itself as a single decisive event. It shows up in small moments like this one, a reaction to a piece of news, a response to a held boundary, a way of handling the very first crack in an old, comfortable dynamic. And over time, those small moments accumulate into an honest map of which relationships were actually built on something real, and which ones were quietly built on your continuous accommodation without either of you ever fully realizing it. Real relationships, the kind worth the effort this whole process demands, are built on a specific, and it turns out, fairly rare ingredient: mutual reality. Both people showing up as themselves, genuinely, including the parts that are inconvenient or uncertain or don't photograph well. Not just the easy, appealing surface. A relationship where one person performs and the other receives the performance can last a long time, can even feel warm in its better moments, but it isn't deep, no matter how many years get logged inside it. It's a relationship between a person and a role, and you've been cast in that role in so many of your closest connections for so long that you may genuinely not know yet what it feels like to be in a relationship where the role simply isn't required. It feels mostly like rest. That's the closest word for it. Like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying long enough that you'd stopped registering the weight of it at all, and only notice it's gone because your shoulders, for the first time in years, aren't doing anything. So how do you actually tell, in real time, which relationships are worth keeping through this transition? Not by what someone says in the easy, comfortable moments. Almost everyone says the right things when nothing's actually being tested. You tell by watching how they handle the harder ones. A person who genuinely cares about you, not just about the specific dynamic you used to represent for them, will be able to tolerate the discomfort of your growth, even when it's inconvenient for them. They might need real time to adjust. They might have honest questions, even moments of visible hurt as things shift. But they'll be able to hold those reactions without turning them into a campaign to pressure you back into the old shape. They'll have actual conversations about what's changing, rather than treating every conversation as an opportunity to lobby for reversal. I have a friend now who I once assumed, years ago, would be one of the relationships that couldn't survive this. She'd grown so used to being the one who called the shots in our friendship, who I'd defer to reflexively, that I genuinely braced for her to disappear once I stopped doing that. She didn't. There was an awkward stretch, a few months of visible discomfort on both sides while the dynamic recalibrated, and then something better than what we'd had before settled in on the other side of it. I wouldn't have predicted that outcome. I'm glad I didn't get to skip finding it out. A relationship worth keeping is also, specifically, one where repair is actually possible after conflict. Not the absence of conflict, but the demonstrated capacity to come back together after it happens. People-pleasers tend to avoid conflict so thoroughly, for so many years, that they genuinely never find out whether a given relationship could survive it, because it never gets tested. They smooth every friction over before it fully surfaces, maintain a surface calm that sits on top of years of entirely unexamined tension, and mistake the absence of visible conflict for evidence of a healthy relationship. It isn't evidence of that. It's frequently evidence of exactly the opposite. That one person has been working very hard, alone, to prevent the relationship from ever having to demonstrate its actual resilience. Conflict doesn't destroy real relationships. Sustained dishonesty does, and as your own honesty increases, some of the previously buried tension in your relationships is going to surface, whether you plan for it or not. Watching which of those relationships can move through that surfacing and come out the other side with more actual closeness, rather than less, is one of the genuinely useful discoveries available in this whole process. Because real resilience shows up specifically in the rupture, in whether both people choose to stay in the room and repair it rather than retreat. There's one more category worth naming, because it's easy to overlook. Somewhere in your life, there are probably relationships that got quietly undertended during your years of people-pleasing. Connections with people who were simply less demanding, less prone to creating the kind of interpersonal crisis that always pulled your attention and energy first. Those people often got the least of you, precisely because they never required the full activation of your accommodating machinery to get along with. As you recover real energy that used to go entirely into monitoring and managing everyone else, it's worth turning some of it back toward those quieter connections. They may have more to offer than you realized while your attention was being consumed somewhere louder. You don't get to know in advance which relationships will make it through this transition and which won't. That's not something an audit performed at the start of the process can answer for you. It gets answered gradually through the accumulating evidence of how people actually respond as you keep showing up differently. Give them the chance to show you which they are. Give yourself the chance to find out too, because some of what survives will surprise you in both directions, and the surprises are usually where the truest information was hiding the whole time. Chapter 13. The hardest no in the house. Everything in this book so far has probably sounded manageable in theory, even the hard parts, as long as you were picturing it applied to a colleague, an acquaintance, a friend of a few years, whose opinion matters but isn't load-bearing for your entire sense of who you are. Saying no to a coworker asking for a favor, holding a boundary with someone in your social circle. These are difficult, but they're a difficulty you can prepare for, rehearse, walk into with some confidence that you'll survive the aftermath intact. Then there's your mother, or your father, your partner, a sibling you've known since before either of you had language for any of this. And with them, none of the preparation seems to transfer the way it did everywhere else. The rehearsed sentence gets to your throat and stops there. This isn't a failure of technique. It's an accurate recognition that some relationships carry more structural weight than others. That some people's disappointment registers in your body at a completely different volume than a coworker's ever could. Because these are the relationships where the original pattern got built in the first place, decades before you had any language to describe what was happening to you. Family is usually where the blueprint gets drawn, and it's worth understanding why family systems resist a member's change with a force that can feel wildly disproportionate to whatever specific boundary you're actually trying to hold. Every family develops its own equilibrium over years, an unspoken agreement about who occupies which role, who absorbs conflict, who keeps the whole atmosphere stable so nobody else has to. If you've spent your life as the one who does that job, the peacekeeper, the accommodating one, the person who makes themselves smaller so the overall temperature of the room stays livable, that role isn't just a personal habit. It's load-bearing for the entire system. And when the person holding up a load-bearing wall starts to step back from it, it isn't only their own behavior that shifts. The whole structure feels it all at once, which is exactly why a boundary that would land as unremarkable coming from someone with a different family history can produce, from your family specifically, a reaction that feels wildly out of proportion to what you actually said. Understanding that doesn't make the reaction painless, but it does make it legible. When a parent responds to a new limit with visible, deep hurt, or a sibling reacts to an honest conversation with accusations of selfishness, or an entire holiday gathering shifts in temperature the moment you stop automatically absorbing the role you've always played. None of that is primarily a judgment of your character, however much it's dressed up to sound like one. It's the system, as a system, attempting to restore whatever equilibrium it had built around the old version of you. And for possibly the first time in your life, you have the option of simply declining to be restored to it. Partners bring their own particular version of this complexity, one that deserves its own honest attention. If you entered a significant relationship while deep in these patterns, which is common, since people-pleasers are often drawn to relationships precisely because being useful, accommodating, endlessly available feels like the safest way to secure them. Then that relationship got built around a specific version of you. One who agreed more, needed less, absorbed more than the version now emerging. Your partner organized their understanding of the relationship, and often some understanding of themselves within it, around that earlier version. When you start to change, you're not only changing individually, you're renegotiating the actual terms of the relationship, whether either of you planned for that renegotiation or not. Here is one of the harder truths in this entire book, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than softened. Some relationships sustained by one person's continuous accommodation genuinely will not survive that accommodation ending. Not because either person involved is a bad person, because the accommodation was doing real structural work, filling a gap, compensating for a mismatch that honesty simply reveals rather than creates. Facing that possibility honestly is one of the most painful parts of this entire process. And it's also, over time, one of the most necessary for the relationships that can genuinely hold the weight of who you're actually becoming. I sat across from someone I loved deeply a few years into this work and said out loud, for what felt like the first time in that relationship, something true and uncomfortable about what I needed instead of what I thought would keep the peace. There was a long silence after it. I remember thinking, in that silence, that I might have just ended something. I hadn't. What came after that silence was harder and more honest than anything that had come before it in years. But it was real in a way the peace I'd been keeping never actually was. The path through this runs specifically through honest conversation, not confrontation, not the performance of newfound assertiveness aimed at proving a point, but genuine, direct communication about what you've been doing, what it's cost you, what's shifting now, and what you actually need going forward. These conversations are hard. They're the specific kind of hard that produces something real afterward, an honest reckoning between two people genuinely committed to knowing each other, rather than continuing to perform smoothly for each other indefinitely. For a partner who loves you and is secure enough to actually hear you, that conversation isn't a threat to the relationship. It's an invitation into a more honest version of it. The hardest moment in all of this, and it will likely come at some point, no matter how carefully you prepare for it, is the moment someone you love deeply reacts to your honesty with something that feels like the withdrawal of their love. A parent going cold, a partner pulling distant. This activates the oldest, most primal fear the entire pattern was built to prevent in the first place, that you are, underneath the performance, genuinely unlovable, that the love was always conditional on the accommodation and never actually about you at all. Sitting with that fear without immediately acting to dissolve it, without reverting, without smoothing it back over the way you've smoothed over everything else for decades, is among the hardest things this whole process will ask of you. It's also, if you can stay with it, the thing that finally shows you what was actually there all along. Love that disappears the moment you become genuinely yourself was never love of you in the first place. And love that stays, adjusted, maybe initially uncomfortable, but genuinely present on the other side of the discomfort, is the only kind that was ever actually counting. Chapter 14. The Ordinary Tuesday Practice. There's a version of this process a lot of people imagine when they first start understanding what people-pleasing actually is and what it takes to change it. In that version, you do the work, you read the book, You have the hard conversations. You sit with the discomfort. And eventually, you arrive at a kind of permanent state, self-possessed and finished, where the old patterns are simply gone, and the new way of being runs on its own, the way a habit eventually does once it's fully installed. That version is comforting to imagine. It's also not quite how this actually works, and it's worth saying clearly so you don't mistake the absence of a finish line for evidence that something's gone wrong. Valuing yourself isn't a state you arrive at and then passively inhabit for the rest of your life. It's something you practice daily in the small and mostly unglamorous texture of ordinary days, through choices that don't look significant in the moment, but that accumulate over months and years into a genuinely different relationship with who you are. This chapter is about what that daily practice actually looks like, not in the abstract, but in the specific, particular shape of a Tuesday. It starts in the morning, in the very first choices you make, before the day has had a chance to impose its full weight of demand. What you choose to do with the earliest part of your day, before anyone else's needs have entered the picture, tells you something real about how much space you're genuinely making for your own experience. Not that mornings need to be sacred or elaborately ritualized, but the difference between beginning a day from some connection to your own intentions versus beginning it already managing someone else's requirements is a meaningful one, and it's worth noticing which one you default to. It continues through the day in the quality of attention you bring to your own internal state. People pleasers develop, out of necessity, an extraordinarily well-honed capacity to monitor everyone else's emotional weather, and a correspondingly underdeveloped capacity to monitor their own. You'll often know, almost instantly, when someone nearby is uncomfortable and have genuinely no clear idea what you yourself are feeling until it's grown loud enough to be impossible to ignore. The daily practice includes simple, regular check-ins with yourself, not elaborate ones. What am I actually feeling right now? What do I need right now? Am I honoring that or overriding it for reasons that stopped applying a long time ago? Asked with real curiosity, a few times across an ordinary day, these questions slowly rebuild a connection to your own interior life that years of looking outward wore down. The practice includes how you manage your own commitments, treating the time you've decided to protect for yourself with the same seriousness you'd bring to a commitment made to someone else, rather than letting your own priorities live in whatever scraps of space remain after every external demand has already been accommodated. It includes the language you use about yourself, not the performing humility that comes so easily, prefacing your own ideas with disclaimers about how they're probably wrong before anyone's even heard them, which quietly perpetuates internally the exact dynamic you're trying to dismantle everywhere else. I started, a few years into this, keeping a genuinely tiny habit, noticing at the end of each day one moment where I'd actually shown up for myself instead of automatically overriding what I wanted. Some days the list was short, sometimes just one small thing. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was finally looking. It includes how you receive a compliment, a plain, unadorned thank you, rather than the reflexive deflection that redirects attention away from anything good being said about you. Because allowing something favorable to simply be true without disproving it immediately is its own small, repeated act of tolerating your own worth. And it includes, maybe most importantly, the choices you make specifically when you're tired. Because fatigue is exactly when the old automatic yes has the least resistance to overcome, and it's therefore exactly the moment where pausing, even briefly, and choosing honestly does the most real work. None of this needs to be dramatic to count. The person who ends each ordinary day slightly clearer on their own patterns than they were that morning is building something real, slowly, in the unglamorous consistency most meaningful change actually requires. One Tuesday, quietly, at a time. Chapter 15. Trusting your own read. You've read the same text message 11 times. Not to understand it. You understood it on the first pass, in about 2 seconds. You're reading it again and again because you're not actually looking for meaning anymore. You're looking for permission. Permission to feel however you're already, quietly feeling about it. A little hurt, maybe, or a little dismissed. But you won't let yourself land on that feeling until you've cross-checked it against every possible alternative interpretation. Run the message through enough angles that you can be certain your reaction is the correct one before you're willing to actually have it. This is a specific and often overlooked cost of years spent outsourcing judgment to other people's reactions instead of your own. You stop trusting your own read on things, even the small, ordinary things, even the ones that don't involve anyone else's feelings at all. Am I overreacting becomes a permanent background question, running underneath almost every interaction, quietly auditing your own responses before you've even fully had them. And it's a subtly different problem from the ones covered so far in this book. This isn't about whether you value yourself enough to hold a boundary. It's about whether you trust your own perception enough to know, in the first place, what you're even responding to. The mechanism that produces this is the same one that built everything else in this pattern, applied to a slightly different target. For years, your read of a situation got overridden constantly, by a parent who insisted you weren't actually upset, by a partner who reframed your discomfort as an overreaction, by a workplace where raising a legitimate concern got met with just enough pushback that raising the next one felt riskier. Each of those moments taught the same quiet lesson. Your immediate read of a situation cannot be trusted on its own. It needs outside confirmation before it counts as real. And once that lesson gets reinforced enough times, you stop checking your read against the world occasionally, the way anyone reasonably does, and start checking it constantly, reflexively, on things that never actually needed a second opinion. This shows up in ways that look, from the outside, like simple indecisiveness, but underneath are something more specific. Standing in a doorway trying to determine whether a friend's slightly short reply was actually short, or whether you're imagining it. Replaying a work meeting for an hour afterward, not because anything went wrong, but because you can't locate on your own whether it went fine. Asking someone else repeatedly, "Does that seem weird to you?" About situations where you already know quite clearly exactly how it seems to you. You're just not willing to claim that knowledge without a witness confirming it first. I used to send screenshots of ordinary, unremarkable conversations to a friend, asking her to tell me what she thought was going on in situations where I genuinely already knew. I wasn't looking for her insight. I was looking for someone else to hold the belief before I'd allow myself to hold it fully on my own. Rebuilding trust in your own read is a slightly different project from rebuilding self-worth, even though they're closely related and tend to develop alongside each other. Self-worth is about believing you matter enough to act on your needs once you've identified them. This is earlier than that. It's about believing your own perception is reliable enough to identify them accurately in the first place, without requiring outside verification first. It's the difference between valuing yourself and actually believing yourself. And the second one, for a lot of people, turns out to be the harder gap to close. The practice here starts small and stays small for a while. Deliberately. Notice a reaction to a message, a comment, a shift in someone's tone. And instead of immediately reaching for a second opinion, sit with your own first read for slightly longer than feels comfortable before doing anything else with it. Not acting on it yet, necessarily. Just letting it exist, unverified, as information that might actually be correct on its own. That pause, held even briefly, is where the trust starts to rebuild. Not through some external test proving your read was accurate, but through the simple, repeated experience of your own perception being allowed to stand for a moment before anyone else weighs in on it. Over time, and it does take real time, the volume on that background question, am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? Is this actually how it seems? Starts to drop. Not because you stop ever checking your perceptions against reality. A healthy amount of that is just good judgment. It drops because checking stops being the only thing your perception is allowed to do before it counts. You start to notice more and more that your first read was usually right all along. It had just never been given the chance to be believed without a witness standing there confirming it for you first. Chapter 16. The person who was there all along. There's a specific kind of silence that used to feel like danger to you. Empty evening, no plans, nobody needing anything from you, no performance required, and something in your chest would tighten anyway. Restless, casting around for a task, a person to check on, a small crisis to manage. Anything to fill the space before the quiet started asking questions you weren't ready to answer. You are sitting in that exact silence right now, somewhere near the end of this book, and it doesn't feel like danger anymore. It feels oddly like company. That shift, small, undramatic, easy to miss if you weren't watching for it, is what all of this has actually been building toward. Not a boundary enforcement system, not a set of scripted sentences for difficult conversations, though you'll use plenty of those. The actual destination was always this: a version of you capable of sitting in an empty room without needing to fill it, because the person occupying that room finally feels like enough company on her own. Let's talk honestly about who that person is, because it's easy, moving through a book like this, to imagine the endpoint as some idealized, frictionless version of a human being. Someone who's transcended doubt, who never feels the old pull toward the automatic yes, who navigates every room with effortless, permanent confidence. That person doesn't exist, and chasing her would just be another performance, dressed up in the language of growth instead of accommodation. The actual person on the other side of this work is much more ordinary than that, and much more durable. She still feels the old reflex occasionally, especially under stress, especially in the exact rooms where the pattern first got built. A parent's raised eyebrow, a partner's slightly disappointed tone. The reflex doesn't vanish. What changes is that she recognizes it now for what it is: an old signal, built for a different life. And recognizing it means she finally has something she didn't have before, a choice about whether to follow it. The first thing you'll notice, if you haven't already, is a change in how present you actually are inside your own life. Not divided anymore between the experience itself and the constant background surveillance of how the experience is landing on everyone else in the room. Just there, fully, in the conversation, in the relationship, in the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday. And that quality of presence, it turns out, is something other people feel even when they can't name what's different about you. It has nothing to do with charm or performance. It's the unmistakable quality of someone actually occupying their own life instead of managing an image of it from a slight remove. The second is a different relationship with your own emotions. The ones you spent years keeping carefully out of view because they read, to the old version of you, as too risky to display. Anger, disappointment, plain, unfiltered need. Those emotions become available again, not as a flood that overwhelms you, but as information you can actually name, sit with, and act on appropriately, instead of managing them into invisibility the way you used to manage everything else. The third is confidence, though not the performed kind that so often gets mistaken for the real thing from the outside. The actual version is quieter and stranger, a genuine tested trust that you can handle what arises, that you can be wrong and recover, that you can disappoint someone and remain standing afterward, intact, still yourself. That trust doesn't come from repeating affirmations to yourself in a mirror. It comes from exactly the kind of evidence this whole book has been walking you toward. The accumulated proof, gathered one held boundary and one honest no at a time, that you are considerably more resilient than the old pattern ever gave you credit for. The fourth is a genuine shift in who ends up in your life. Not through anything mystical, a straightforward consequence of no longer performing a version of yourself optimized for universal acceptability. The people who only ever valued the performance start drifting, quietly, without much drama, because there was never much holding them there beyond the performance itself. And the people who were always looking for something real, who are themselves honest enough to recognize honesty when they encounter it, start moving closer, because for the first time they can actually see you clearly enough to do so. And the fifth, hardest to describe because it's felt more than reasoned through, is a change in the voice running underneath everything. The one that used to audit you constantly, scanning for evidence you hadn't been accommodating enough, agreeable enough, sufficiently whatever the room seemed to require. That voice doesn't disappear all at once, and it doesn't disappear completely. But gradually, with the same unglamorous daily practice that's carried you through every chapter of this book, it stops sounding like an auditor and starts sounding like something closer to an ally. Something that notices when you're struggling and responds with something resembling kindness instead of accusation. Something, for maybe the first time in your life, genuinely on your side. You spent a long time believing the route to being loved ran directly through making yourself acceptable to everyone in every room. Shrinking, accommodating, performing whatever version of yourself the moment seemed to require. That belief made sense once. It was built for real reasons, inside real circumstances, by a person doing her genuine best to stay safe in a world that felt too large and too unpredictable to face without a strategy. But the thing you were actually chasing through all of it was never available down that road. It was only ever available down this one. The slower, occasionally uncomfortable, entirely worthwhile process of becoming someone you actually recognize. She's here now, sitting in an ordinary silence that doesn't feel like danger anymore. And this is where her story actually starts. You have never once said no. That's how this book opened, and it was true when you read it, even if some part of you bristled at how plainly it was stated. Somewhere along the way, in whatever room habitually asked the most of you, that sentence stopped being your story. Maybe it happened quietly, in a text you didn't rewrite 11 times. Maybe it happened out loud, at a dinner table that used to make you smaller, in a single flat sentence that required no footnote and no apology attached to it. Maybe it hasn't fully happened yet, and you're closing this book still standing at the edge of that half-second gap, the one between the request landing and the old automatic yes trying to leave your mouth before you've had a chance to weigh in. Wherever you are in it, here is what's actually changed. Whether or not it feels dramatic yet, you know now that the gap exists. You know it's not a personality trait running your life on autopilot. It's a pattern, built for reasons that made sense once, in circumstances that no longer apply to the person you actually are today. And a pattern, unlike an identity, can be interrupted. Slowly, imperfectly. One ordinary Tuesday at a time. There will be moments ahead when the old reflex wins anyway, when the yes escapes before the honest answer has a chance to form, When a boundary dissolves under pressure that felt, in the moment, too significant to hold against. Those moments aren't failures. They're information, showing you exactly where the pattern still has depth left to release. What matters is smaller than perfection and larger than any single moment. That somewhere in an ordinary day, without an audience, without anyone keeping score, you say the two-letter word, out loud, complete. Nothing attached to it, and you're still standing there afterward. That's not the end of the story. It's the actual beginning of it. The one you were always meant to be telling, in your own voice, finally, on your own terms.